Good morning, and thank you, Kelly. Today I'm going to be discussing how to demystify Agile project estimates. And in so doing, what we want to do is there's a few areas I'd like to discuss. Essentially, we're going to talk about the advent of the Agile Manifesto and the subsequent principles that came from doing work in an Agile method. So we'll talk about some of the modeling considerations that you need to do around Agile, as well as some of the modeling, how to model the principles of Agile. Now, typically when I'm building an Agile estimate, I will do it in three different styles: a planning estimate, a forecast estimate, and a working estimate. And I'm going to touch base on each of those three different types of estimates. And finally, before we finish, I'll talk about a few things to consider, because there are a few potential pitfalls that you may encounter. The first thing I want to discuss really is the premise of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. The manifesto came about around the year 2001. A group of different methodologists came together in the Wasatch Mountains, and they said, we're all doing things that are very similar in structure. We just call them different methods. We need to go ahead and pull together some generic principles from which all our different methods can be interacting. Some of the different methods included Scrum, extreme programming, to name a few. Even the Rational Unified Process folks got on board with an Agile Unified Process. So from the advent of the manifesto, out came a set of certain principles that they felt should be considered whenever you're doing an Agile project estimate. So in the presentation on the slide, you'll see that I've outlined some of the principles, and I highlighted the ideas that are really the focal point and ones that affect project estimation. The first one of the principles, they said, is the priority to satisfy the customer. So in all the Agile methods that you'll see, there's a very highly concentrated focus on getting the user involved and having the user participate in the entire development lifecycle. What that's going to mean is an estimate. It's going to mean things like the next line. The requirements are going to be changing over time. So there's going to be a necessity when you build your estimates to plan for requirement volatility, as well as incremental builds that the third one mentions, where you deliver working software frequently. So in an Agile approach, you have changing requirements, and the software to be delivered to the customer in kind of an iterative approach fashion over a time to be determined by the different groups. Now, as the fourth principle says, the business people and developers must work together. So one of those pitfalls we'll talk about later is what might happen if that doesn't happen. And likewise, you're going to have very motivated individuals on the team. So typically an Agile team will have a group of people that have done Agile before, or they're very excited about being part of an Agile process, and they have generally fairly good method practices, and they have some type of leadership functionality that's being provided them through some type of certified mechanism, such as a certified Scrum Master for those doing the Scrum method. A few more of the principles that we'll talk about, though, is that the idea that the teams are working face-to-face, so there isn't one central role. Everyone tends to share into different job responsibilities. For example, you don't have essentially 2 or 3 coders, 2 or 3 testers, a quality control person, and a configuration manager. Essentially, everyone will take their turn doing each of those different roles. So you have a very synergistic type of team, and they are dedicated to some type of technical excellence, but they're trying to make the work simple. And they want to be able to maximize their efficiency by keeping the problem in a small, easy-to-manage type of fashion. So we go back and take a look at some of those principles, and we try to figure out where they would map into a parametric model. It starts to lay out quite nicely. If you look in the top, we say, welcoming changing requirements, even late in development. Well, it's easy to map those to the requirement side. But when you are going to do this mapping, then you have to understand what it means. It means that when you're looking at your requirements parameters, you need to expect very high volatility, that you're not going to have a set of baseline requirements when you first get started, and you need to expect those changes over time. Subsequently to that is delivering working software frequently. That's going to tell you that you're going to be building a model using some type of iterative development methodology. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project, building projects around motivated individuals and self-organizing teams. Now these are all talking about the people skills and the structure of your work team. So your resources, you're going to have to expect them to be dedicated resources. They should be co-located. One of those pitfalls we'll talk about a little bit is multi-site development and disparate teams working on remote locations. That doesn't work very well in an Agile environment. staff loading, you must probably consider that you're going to have everyone you need right when you get started. And then the personnel capabilities, which are usually very key parameters and effort drivers, is that you're going to probably have analysts and programmers from the higher percentile rankings. When looking at an actual parametric model that was built, this is an example of five different methodologies, development methodologies that I provided in here for software to see what the differences may be. And what you'll see is that when you compare an Agile project to like a waterfall or a RUP or a spiral or even one of the older object-oriented design and programming methods, Agile does actually provide you with a shorter schedule period. But what's really noticeable, though, is that the actual effort itself and the delivered defects are all considerably shorter than the traditional methods. So how do you want to build the estimates? Typically, I will break it down to those three areas I talked about before: the planning estimate, the forecast estimate, and the working estimate. The planning estimate, let's talk about that one first. It's really no different than what you've been doing in the past whenever you're trying to get your arms around the initial size of what a project's going to be. If you're doing like a rough order of magnitude estimate, you're still going to have some indication of how big the problem's going to be. And typically you can do that using analogies to previous projects of similar size and type. You're still going to need to know, the who's you're working with, the where's in the house. If you look inside the Principles of the Manifesto, you'll see that you're talking about having those business people available, your subject matter experts need to be available, your team needs to be synergistic, all those types of things. So you want to make sure that if you're going to be thinking that you're doing Agile downstream, that's going to be a factor that you actually have those principles of the manifesto in place. But essentially, the planning estimate is just very similar to a typical traditional top-down estimate. In fact, what you really want to do is you want to build it exactly the same way. And if this is the first time you're ever doing Agile, I really wouldn't expect that you're going to see a real significant benefit in your estimate out at the planning estimate stage. Now, you know that it's been prophesized and proven that Agile can provide you faster and somewhat cheaper, less effort type projects. But for your first time you're going through the process, it's probably not going to pan out that you're going to see those benefits until you've done Agile on 2 or 3 different programs. The second estimate I build is actually what ends up being my forecasting estimate, and this is the one I will subsequently use to submit my budget request. So when you're building a forecast estimate, there's a few things you have to have in place. First thing you have to do is you have to establish your backlog. A backlog is essentially what is the big stack of stuff that you're going to be delivering. Okay? So when you are getting your arms around your backlog or your set of deliverable products, you have already identified what type of incremental deliveries you're going to be making to your customer that's going to make them satisfied so that they can get little pieces of the actual effort over time. Now remember, a customer may not necessarily be the ultimate end user. Your customer may just be a system test team that's a little bit downstream, where the folks that are building the engineering test models, and they have to have the code ready to put it on the engineering test model. So who the customer is and how you're working with them, that's defined independently of what your project deliverable will be. You also need to identify what that release cycle is going to be. How many iterations you're going to have per delivery cycle, how many days that you think there should be to an iteration. Because in an Agile method, you typically want to have all your iterations of the same fixed length period of time. And the reason you're doing that is for estimation purposes. You now have a mechanism by which you say, at such and such a point in time, we're going to deliver this feature or this type of capability to you, Mr. User. And then finally, you need to have a good understanding of your team and make sure that your team and your customer is fully engaged. The last bullet we talk about, though, the thrill of discovery is negotiated. And that's when we're going to talk about scope creep. One of the things that happens over and over in Agile projects is the discovery of capabilities from a user's perspective. A lot of times, you'll provide them with a solution to a problem that exceeded their expectations, and it's not unusual for them to say, wow, I didn't know you could do that. Could you do this? Or can we do it this way? In which case, that's fine if it's within your iteration cycle. But a lot of times it will happen that thrill of discovery really percolates up to a much bigger feature, a much bigger requirement than what was originally negotiated during the iteration process. So you have to decide if this is something that's going to go into a backlog pile for the next iteration, or maybe even moved out to a future release of some sort. And finally, the working estimate is really what's going to be your day-to-day estimate. And you really can't prepare your very first working estimate until after you've done your first iteration. Something has to have already been delivered to the customer, and so you have to have an understanding of what was it that you were able to accomplish during that iteration cycle. If you're using story points, which is the most popular methodology for calculating size in an Agile environment, after the first iteration, you have an understanding of how many story points you can deliver during one iteration. And once you've been able to identify how much you can get done over a period of time, it'll start being a little bit easier for you to understand over the entire life cycle of all the increments how much functionality you're going to be able to deliver to the customer at the end of the project. Okay? But also in the working estimate, after the first iteration, you've had a chance to assess your team and the customer. You know, is that customer proactive, or are they distracted, or are they hyperactive? Are you really performing as an Agile project group itself? I mean, do you have a certified Scrum Master? Are they being involved? Or are you just kind of being a dysfunctional type of team? So you need to make that type of assessment. And then, as I mentioned before, you need to understand what your individual team velocities are. How much work can you get done during an iteration so that you know that the next iteration you have a certain velocity to plan for. And then you also have to understand how much time you're going to need to go back and refactor your work. So that means refactoring your estimate with each iteration. So if you're going to look at parametric modeling and building an estimate, there's a lot of really specific parameter areas that you want to consider. So if you think back upon the principles we were talking about, most of these we already discussed, but there's a few other ones that we'll touch on as well. So the requirements, formality, and volatility, those are fairly self-explanatory. In Agile, you're really trying to discover what it is you're building. You're not trying to build something based on a premise of how it's going to work early in the development life cycle. But you also are going to be looking at personnel capabilities, the familiarity of the process, and the process maturity. So is your staff really ready to be doing an Agile process, or have they done this before? So those are all different parameter values that may be affected. As well as automated tool usage. It's very advantageous in an Agile environment to have, for example, automated test code generators. Those are the types of tools that facilitate these quick iterations and the refactoring capability. But likewise, when you're going to be doing that testing, to what level is the testing going to be done? Typically, in an iteration, when you're done, when you say you're done with that feature, you've actually thoroughly tested it, and it's going to have some type of level to which it's being tested. So that will have to be considered as well when you're building your Agile project. And then also the quality assurance participation or quality control participation. Are they going to be oppressive or supportive? And that's something you're probably learning over time, but it's something that you want to make sure you negotiate or have an understanding of before you build your estimates. Okay? So for each of those three different estimates that we talked about, the planning, the forecasting, and the working estimate, there's a lot of things you really need to consider parametrically, but also in a higher level, there's three areas that you want to make sure you attention to. One is you want to make sure you gauge the organization. Are we really ready to be doing this? What is the role of QA, as we just previously mentioned? And do you have everybody in place to get started on the project? And then, after you've built your first iteration, you want to go back and repeat that very first bullet. Go back and see, are you really functioning as an effective Agile team? And what you may really want to do, though, is pay attention to the backlog. What types of things are in your backlog stack? Are your features not being developed because of process immaturity, or is there even more requirements of volatility than you expected? But you pay attention to what is not making it out of the feature release or an iteration cycle and going back into a backlog will give you an idea of how you're performing. Okay. A few more things to consider. You want to look for the sweet spot. And the sweet spot in Agile means that you after the first iteration or two, you're going to start seeing where your team is performing velocity-wise. So one iteration may be 28 story points. The next iteration might be 15 story points. There's going to be some sweet spot in there where your team can operate, function in the most efficient manner. Okay. The other thing to be worried about is scope creep. You want to make sure that you are still within the iteration trying to build a feature within the reasonableness of the user's requirements. If they start to exceed the reasonableness, then again, you either want to put that requirement back onto the backlog pile or create a new feature that's going to be addressed in some other future time. Okay. Remember, the emphasis in Agile is on the stuff that you're delivering, not how much time it's going to take or even the effort it's going to take to deliver it. Okay. And also, you do want to consider what your specific Agile methodology is. Each of them have different approaches. There's Scrum, XP, or paired programming, extreme programming, it's also called paired programming, maybe a lean Agile method. They all have different cycles and iteration approaches and even expectations of what should be delivered. Okay. So that kind of concludes the discussion for today, and we'll open it up for questions.